Hi, and welcome to the 55th in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. We're going to talk today about British Egypt and Sudan. For those of you who are unfamiliar, these are the rules. The first is that this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. I'm a lay quasi-expert, and hopefully I'll be able to take you through this part of history. That said, I will try to give a secular presentation, trying to see all the different perspectives and viewpoints. But this, like all other topics in the Middle Eastern history series, is a sensitive topic, so let's be respectful of diverging opinions. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put that in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I also like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I will give you the basics and you can begin to understand what's going on. And a 201 meaning that if you know the basics, you'll still learn something in addition. So the other thing that I like to do is what I call a 2-hour hard stop, so that 9 p.m. Eastern time, that will be the end of my presentation. So whatever slide we're on, that will be the last slide. And we'll still continue if there are questions, comments, but we won't review any new material, and that ensures that we end on time. When I put dates below a person, those are their years of service. If they are president, prime minister, sultan, whatever role they have, those are the dates, their years of service. It is probably not going to be their birth date, because nobody assumes office when they're born. In some cases, it can be their death date, but in most cases, it isn't. And this is recorded, so you can watch it later, like all other entries in the Middle Eastern Islamic History series and all the other series that are performed by different presenters in this group. You can see those on our YouTube page. The link is there, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel and you can see all the past recordings. Of course, you will be able to see this recording when it is uploaded and properly organized. And finally, we appreciate PayPal donations. We especially appreciate them because YouTube, Meetup, and Zoom all cost money. We're happy to provide these discussions free of charge, but please understand that these things cost money, and therefore we do appreciate any help you're willing to give us. All right, so today we're going to talk about a dynasty that exists in numerous different titles. So it's a little bit complicated in that respect, right? At the beginning, we have leaders that are called walis, or governors. Then in 1867, they received the permission to declare that they are khedive, or a viceroy. And they retain that as long as they are part of, de jure speaking, legally speaking, the Ottoman Empire. In 1914, they are cut off from the Ottoman Empire, and so they term their government a sultanate. But then in 1922, they sign a Declaration of Independence that is recognized by the British, who are the occupying authority at the time, and they call their leaders kings. Now, the dynasty itself is the Alawiya dynasty, because they're all descended from Muhammad Ali. So Alawiya Ali, Muhammad Ali. And so you may hear the term wali, khedive, sultan, melek to refer to different members of this dynasty. It's not a change in government in the sense of there's a new power vacuum that's been created and a new group is coming to the fore. It's simply a recognition that the title of the country is changing so many times during this really formative period in modern Egyptian history. So to sort of ground us in where we are, and if you want more depth on this, you can watch episodes 29 and 30 in the series, where we go into really a lot of depth about these events. But Napoleon invades Egypt when it is under the control of the Ottoman Empire in the late 1700s, 1798, I believe, or 1799. And in his invasion, he's able to completely defeat the Neo-Mamluks, who are the ruling dynasty. They are wali, they are governors under the larger Ottoman Empire. And during this period, the French come together and they bring local populations together in order to create legislative development. So you have, for example, the Egyptian Divan, meaning Egyptian parliament or conciliatory chamber. And the British eventually work with the Ottomans to a very small degree, but the British primarily expel the French from Egypt in 1802 following the Battle of Alexandria. And you now have this change in the Egyptian mindset, because for the last 300 years under Ottoman control, the idea of an independent Egypt or a quasi-independent Egypt was really outside of the scope of thought of most Egyptians. One thing to bear in mind is that Egyptians had not been ruled by an ethnic Egyptian since the time of the Persian Empire in 500 BC. So they had been under government, some based in Egypt, some based outside of Egypt, but never under an Egyptian leader. So the idea that they should be governing themselves, coordinating their own affairs of state, was rather shocking to the Egyptian national consciousness. In fact, it may well be said to have created it. That said, a number of different individuals tried to fill the breach now that the French were removed, but the French had not been really removed by the Ottomans. They'd been removed by the British, who didn't want to maintain control of Egypt at this point. They weren't strong enough to maintain that and fight Napoleon on the European mainland. So you had a number of different individuals trying to vie for that position of power. And the one who was successful was an Albanian tobacco farmer named Muhammad Ali. And Albania as in from Southern Europe. So his native languages were Albanian and Turkish. He did not speak Arabic. In fact, most of his descendants will also not speak Arabic, despite governing a people whose dominant language is Arabic. And he decided to create an Egyptian state. So what does that mean? The first thing is that he had to contend with the traditional rulers of the territory. Now, the French had severely weakened them, but these were the people who actually maintained the country, and these are the Neo-Mamluks. The Neo-Mamluks are a combination of people who are descended from the original Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled the territory from 1250 to 1517, and are generally speaking ethnic Circassian or ethnic Qashqai Turk. So these are people who come from the heart of Central Asia or from what is today Southern Russia. And they have their own languages and they have their own set of internal relationships. And then these Mamluks intermarried with the Janissary Corps, which was made of mostly Balkans people, Albanians, Bosnians, Bulgarians, who had converted to Islam and were serving at the behest of the Ottoman sultans. So two people from wildly different regions. They had come to Egypt, they lived in Egypt, intermarried with each other, but they would not intermarry with the Egyptian population, which they saw as beneath them. And these groups began to work relatively well with Muhammad Ali because Muhammad Ali was also Albanian, right? So they had that sort of historical connection. That said, the Neo-Mamluks were now subordinate to him as opposed to being in the primary position. There's a question here of, is Egypt the top producer of sugar currently? Egypt is one of the leading producers of sugar today. It's also one of the leading producers of rice. These are sort of the bases of the Egyptian economy, along with cotton. But the problem of cotton is that it rises and falls in demand, and there are numerous places in the world that can make cotton more cheaply than Egypt, like the southern part of the United States. So we're going to see that situation changing throughout the 19th century, right? Obviously today, the United States can't produce cotton at the cost that Egyptians can, but at this period, the labor system in the United States was slightly different than it is currently. There was a large internship program. There's a question as to whether native Egyptians were treated as sort of serfs or slaves. Serfs is probably more accurate. That's definitely something that we see during this period. And so there becomes a very strong class hierarchy, especially as we go further and further down the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. We're going to see that Egyptians, by and large, are second-class citizens in what should, in theory, be their own country. And these Circassians, Turks, Albanians are the dominant minorities. And when we're talking about minority, we're talking about these groups combined make up less than 2% of Egypt's population. So that should give you a sense of how disproportionate the relationship was. Muhammad Ali engaged in a massive development of Egypt in order to turn it into a modern, thriving country. Now, he decided to foment a strong relationship with the French, getting French experts to come and modernize the economy. In so doing, he built significant amounts of irrigation using corvée labor, which means that the Egyptian population would be forced to work without proper pay or compensation at the order of the government. So it's not quite slavery, but it's very close to that. He also used, now that all this irrigation was existing, to produce cotton. As we've discussed in other presentations, in the Levant region, cotton had already been demonstrated to be an effective cash crop, and so Muhammad Ali was using it to galvanize his territory. He also purchased and constructed his own ships that would match European ships of the day. He had the French build an école polytechnique, or an engineering school, that would function in creating new engineers within Egypt. He began to develop rail travel in Egypt, and he sent numerous students to Europe, in fact, creating a fund that would begin to facilitate those those foreign studies, so that way those students could then return to Egypt and apply what they knew. And of course, he reassessed the way the land was divided and changed the taxation system in order to create a positive net income for Egypt. He also completely revitalized aspects of the criminal code. Now, one of the things that was very surprising, at least to most of the Muslims in Egypt, was that he began to incorporate secular notions of criminality and punishment and how they should be organized, in contrast to the way that they had been done under the Ottoman Empire, which was much closer to the traditional views of the Sharia. Some things that he included were autopsy evidence. For those who may be familiar with Islamic burial customs, right, Muslims need to be buried within 24 hours of passing away, and the disruption of the body is seen as something that is sacrilege. Nevertheless, Muhammad Ali was able to trade on his fame and his ability to unite the country in order to include autopsy evidence as part of the criminal justice system. And he fortified that by creating a police system that would continue to be the internal police system throughout his reign and the reign of his Alawiya successors. But he didn't just stop there. He actually completely revolutionized the military. Most importantly, with his Jaysh Nizami, which you can see in the upper left-hand side, his national, literally it translates to systemic army, but it refers to the national army that he built along French lines and with numerous French advisors. You can see Joseph Antoine Sèvres, who was a French colonel, who moved to Egypt permanently and became affiliated with Muhammad Ali and the Alawiya dynasty more broadly. The Egyptians called him Suleiman Basha al-Faransawi, or Prince Solomon, the French one. There's a question of, did Muhammad Ali send native students to Europe or just from the ruling classes? He primarily sent individuals from those ruling classes, right? There were definitely some Egyptians that were sent abroad, some native Egyptians, but by and large, we're talking about that upper tier, that upper crust of Turks, Albanians, and Circassians who are ruling and governing Egyptian society. Those are the ones who are being sent. But into these large armies like the Jaysh Nizami, you're having a mix of native Egyptians and the traditional ruling classes. And in fact, to bring his conscripted forces into line, because the Jaysh Nizami was created through conscription, he would bring in Bedouin deserters, Bedouin deserter patrols. Now, traditionally, the Bedouins had been difficult to corral into the civilizing endeavor from the perspective of the settled states because they were nomadic, and so it was hard to tax them. And number two, a lot of their methods of gaining wealth were ones where they would attack sedentary civilizations. But Muhammad Ali found a use in paying them to hunt down those who would flee the military conscription orders And so there began to be a new relationship that developed between Muhammad Ali and the Bedouin. And of course, those who violated the rules of the military were subject to numerous physical punishments. The bastinado is probably the most famous of them, where a person's legs would be tied to a pole and then they would be struck by a whip from the underside. And the military that Muhammad Ali developed was incredibly robust. A particular example of this, and we talked about it in episode 30 and in episode 52, was the war with the first Saudi government. Now, this is the same royal family as the one that rules the current Saudi Arabia, but this was an early incarnation of that state, and that state has come in and out of existence, as we discussed in episode 52 more in depth. But the Ottoman Empire tried to defeat this Saudi state because that Saudi state had pillaged the city of Basra within the Ottoman Empire and had conquered the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And while the Ottomans, with their larger military, were unable to wrest any areas from Saudi control, Ibrahim Pasha, the son of Muhammad Ali, was able to bring these more modernized troops of the Jaysh Nizami and effectively remove the entire existence of the Saudi state. In fact, he committed numerous massacres throughout Saudi Arabia in order to, at least in his view, remove the possibility of their Wahhabi doctrine. As we know from today, he was not successful in eradicating that perspective. There's a question of, were there any established routes for natives to work their ways into acceptance among the colonizing ruling classes? Absolutely. Those natives that were conscripted into the Jaysh Nizami or into the Navy or into other aspects of the military could rise through the ranks and become more and more respected. There were also abilities, and we're going to talk about the cultural development of Egypt. Much of the cultural development of Egypt was done by native Egyptians. And those who improved themselves that way could become effectively bourgeoisie in this new system, and they would be interacting on a day-to-day basis with the Turks, Circassians, and Albanians who formed that upper class. So there wasn't a hard line in the sense of a native could never aspire to higher positioning, but there was a lot of difficulty in breaking through and out of that lower level of poverty. And there's a question of, was Mecca a pilgrimage site during Ibrahim Pasha's rule? Ibrahim Pasha actually never rules himself. He predeceases his father. So he never actually takes control of the government. That said, during the Egyptian control of Mecca and Medina, which starts in 1813 and ends in 1840, there certainly is a number of people who will go to Mecca and Medina for Hajj. Hajj is a part of Islamic ritual and practice all the way since the beginning of the religion. And since Muhammad Ali was still a vassal, at least in theory, of the Ottoman Empire, many Ottomans felt that it was acceptable to go. And there were numerous treaties that were made between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian states. At this point, it would have been the Qajar dynasty, in order to allow Shiite Muslims in Iran to make Hajj as well. Now, Muhammad Ali also intervened in the Ottoman war against the Greeks. We talked about the Greek revolution in episode 28. And in particular, this was a point where Muhammad Ali's navy shines and wins key victories where the Ottoman Empire was unable to effectively push back against their enemy. And in fact, the only reason that the Egyptians intervened was under the pretense that they could get territories in Greece if they were victorious. Unfortunately, because of the British, French, and Russian joint naval intervention in the Battle of Navarino in 1827, the Greeks ended up becoming independent, and Muhammad Ali had to accept only lesser compensation for his effective near defeat of the Greek rebels on land. And we're getting to a point where Egypt is so powerful that it's directly threatening the Ottoman Empire. You can see this sort of line that stretches from Egypt all the way to the Sea of Marmara, near to Istanbul. And that's because the Egyptian forces in the Egyptian Ottoman Wars of 1831 to 1833 literally bulldozed their way through the Levant region, through southern Turkey, all the way nearly to Constantinople to take over that empire. And it was only through the intervention of the Russians that the Egyptians were stopped. For those of you who may remember, the Russians are the arch enemy of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans themselves couldn't even believe that it was the Russians who saved them. But the European powers were much more willing to suffer a weak Ottoman Empire than a strong Egypt whose alliances and orientations they couldn't be sure of. There's a question of which empire had superior maritime capabilities. The Egyptian Empire had much better maritime capabilities than the Ottoman Empire. As we've discussed in some of the previous episodes, the Ottoman Empire's navy was, for want of a better term, sad and incapable. Anytime that they were against even the Balkan states fielded better navies, like Greece, for example, fielded better navies than the Ottoman Empire could. Egypt couldn't compete with the European navies of, for example, Russia or England or France, but it was certainly much better than the Ottoman Empire, and it gave the Egyptians an incredible power of projection across the Mediterranean. In 1840, there was another war between the Ottomans and the Egyptians, where the Egyptians again defeated the Ottomans, and the British compelled the Egyptians to accept a lesser sentence, meaning that they would have to give up all of their territories in the Levant, in Saudi Arabia, and make the line between what is today Egypt and Israel. That border would be their eastern border. But Muhammad Ali would get one of the things that he was desperately trying to fight for, which was the recognition of the legitimacy of his dynasty. So his children and their children would succeed them in order to create a stable Egyptian state. Previously, walis, or governors of the various territories under the Ottoman Empire, would be appointed and removed at the will of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. But now, under the Convention of London, Muhammad Ali is guaranteed that he will have his title, and so will all of his descendants and heirs. So, as we can see from this map, Egypt has its expansion, and we talked about Greece, we talked about Saudi Arabia, we talked about the Levant, but we haven't talked about the Sudan. And so you can see, just as Egypt was expanding, between its expansion in Saudi Arabia and its expansion in Greece is when it expanded south into the Sudan. Now, we should understand that, as we discussed last time, that Sudan was a very different country than Egypt was, and Sudan had been separated from Egypt from the time of the first Muslim conquest in the early 600s until the 1270s. There was a peace treaty signed between the Egyptians and the Sudanese, and because of this, Sudan remained a mostly Christian country until the mid 14th century. And most of them were Coptic Christians, especially in the states of Makuria and Alodia. Now, beginning in the 1200s, there began to be interference from the Egyptian Mamluks. These are the ones that were in power from 1250 to 1517. But by and large, the Sudanese were able to repel them and create their own states. The most powerful of these was the Sultanate of Funj. And the Sultanate of Funj was able to bring together a number of different tribes across the Sudan. And we should understand that the Sudan at this point is a region. It's not a singular country. You have a number of different tribes that are operating in different regions with various different religions. For example, you can see the Shukriya at the top. The Shukriya are an Arabo-Muslim tribe, but in the south, closer to Sennar, you have a number of groups that are animistic in their beliefs or Christian in their beliefs, still following the Coptic Church. And the penetration of Islam is coming and going at different speeds. Funj itself was nominally Muslim, but they supported the non-Muslim sacred traditions that existed, especially in the southern part of the country. And the various areas in the Funj Sultanate operated under a highly feudal system, meaning that each of the towns, each of the cities, and the tribes would be responsible themselves for governance in areas, and they would report to the Funj Sultan, on areas of national security and things of that nature. But in terms of local laws and administration, the Sultan had almost no power. So you have this very diffuse set of powers, and eventually the Funj Sultanate simply melts away in the sense that more and more of the tribes along the periphery begin to declare independence by simply no longer paying tribute, no longer recognizing the Funj Sultan in Sennar, and becoming more and more affiliated with their own territory and their own ambitions. So the collapse of the Funj leaves open the possibility of conquest from the north. And so Muhammad Ali tasks his third son, Ismail Kamil, to attack the tribes to the furthest north. And the goal of this is actually quite straightforward. Muhammad Ali wants to replace the Egyptians, the Turks, the Albanians who are forming his Jaysh Nizami with a slave soldier army. Those slave soldiers would be directly responsible to him, and they would be individuals from whom he would have unquestioned loyalty. So he directs the attack into the region of Kordofan, which is the southern part of what is today the country of Sudan, not South Sudan yet, but the southern part of North Sudan. So, he targets this region specifically because it has significant numbers of people. This is particularly arable territory in between the Blue and White Nile rivers. If we look at the map from the previous page, you can see as the Nile River comes south, close to the letter J in the Funj here, you can see that it splits into the White Nile and the Blue Nile. And this area called the Gezira is a very fertile region in the Sudan, significant numbers of people. And of course, that is where Muhammad Ali chooses to attack. The first tribe that he comes up against is the Shagaya. And you can see the Shagaya above. They resist under their leader, a woman named Muhaira, but they are defeated. And Ismail Kamil orders his troops that they saying that they will receive 30 piastres for every pair of ears that they collect from those who resist. And so he began to get entire buckets and piles of these ears from the Shagaya tribesmen. And the Shagaya eventually capitulated. And in fact, the Shagaya themselves became the first of these slave soldiers put to work for the Egyptian government in conquering their neighboring tribes. And the Shagaya themselves were just as violent and just as powerful in terms of the way that they would attack their enemies as the Egyptians had been to them. And so you began to see this large slave collecting culture develop by the Egyptians as an imperial entity in the Sudan region. Now, significant numbers of these slaves began to be transported further north, but the climate in Sudan is very different than the climate further north. And so numerous Sudanese died in transit as slaves. Ismail Kamil pressed his attack increasingly further south to the city of Sennar, which of course he had heard was a great city, and during the high days of the Funj Sultanate, it had been. But by the time he arrived in 1821, the city was relatively dilapidated. And so he felt like he had failed to acquire something of great value. So as the Egyptians unified the Sudan under their territory, it became known to the Sudanese as Aturkiya, or the Turkish period, because remember, Muhammad Ali was an Albanian by ethnicity, and he spoke Turkish with all of his leading advisors. So from the position of the Sudanese, their government was a Turkish government. Never mind, of course, that Muhammad Ali was, at least nominally, still a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, still a part of the Ottoman Empire. And so the view was that he was effectively part of that larger Turkish empire, the Ottoman Empire. So this period is called Turkish Sudan, despite the fact that it is an Egyptian government, and by Egyptian, I mean in the territory of Egypt, an Egyptian government that is controlling them. During this period, you see Egypt treat this territory as a colonial possession in much the same way that Europeans had treated other colonial possessions. We talked about the numerous modernizing reforms that Muhammad Ali did in the main part of Egypt, creating new railroads, about educating the population, creating new systems of irrigation and cotton production, and improving the economy. He did none of that here in the Sudan. The first thing that he did was the massive forced conscription that we've already talked about. To those who remained free, he imposed a heavy burden of taxation. He also began to build slave markets in the city of Khartoum. And Khartoum itself was a construction of Muhammad Ali. The area was relatively undeveloped, and he decided to build a capital city there at the confluence of the Blue and White Niles. He also extracted three major resources, or attempted to, from the Sudan other than human capital. And those were gold, ivory, and gum arabic. Now, gold existed in some alluvial areas, and small amounts were collected, but far more prevalent was his belief that he would find gold in the pyramids that existed in Sudan. Now, those who may be familiar know that Sudan actually has more pyramids than Egypt does. It just happens that those pyramids are much smaller in size. Muhammad Ali ordered Ismail Kamil and his successors to smash some of these pyramids in order to find the gold hidden within. Eventually, he gave up on it, but quite a number of the Meroitic pyramids, which you can see some of those that remain today, were destroyed in search of this gold. Ivory and gum arabic were much more easily collected historically, and there was a significant ivory trade, especially in the southern parts of the Sudan. And gum arabic is an emulsifier. It keeps sugar in a beverage. For example, that's why when you buy soda, you don't just find a bunch of sugar at the bottom of the can, which would happen, right, naturally precipitating out of the water. The gum arabic keeps the sugar in the water, and it's itself relatively sweet. So it was a highly prized commodity that grew on a number of trees in the Sudan. There's a question of, isn't Khartoum known for their tobacco? Today it is. And there was tobacco growing that occurred during this period. But by and large, that was secondary to these other three major exports, and and slavery too, for exports. So Muhammad Ali, and when he died, he was succeeded by his nephew in 1848, and Abbas Helmi tried to do everything in his power to reverse the modernization that Muhammad Ali did. But thankfully, his regime was not terribly long. He was succeeded by his half-uncle, Muhammad Said Pasha, and we're going to see more of those reforms. There's a question, is gum arabic the precursor to today's guar gum used for the same purpose? No, they're related substances. Gum arabic is still used today. So when Said Pasha came to power, Said Pasha, even more than Muhammad Ali, was a Francophile, and he really built the relationship that Egypt had with the French, leading to the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps building the Suez Canal. So he began that project, and that project would receive there were shares given to the Egyptian government, there were shares given to the French government, and there were some shares also given to the British, who helped fund certain aspects of the project. Now, the Suez Canal was an incredibly difficult endeavor. It took several years to complete, and the technology was very new at the time. So you can imagine how difficult this was and how much of an achievement it had been that Said Pasha was able to preside over. His relationship with he also expanded the cotton that Muhammad Ali had begun to grow, and this coincided almost perfectly with the United States Civil War. Now, historically, the British and the French primarily imported their cotton from the US South, where the abundance of slave labor made the cost of cotton relatively cheap, and the large plantations also drove down the price, meaning that the Egyptians, the Levantines, and other cotton producers in the Middle East region could not compete with the United States South. However, the U.S. Civil War made it impossible for the British and the French to continue trading with the U.S. South, given the approach that those countries, at least nominally, had in opposition to slavery. This meant that there was an intense demand for the cotton that Egypt could produce, and this led to an economic boom within Egypt, corresponding to the time that the U.S. Civil War was ongoing. Another aspect of the United States Civil War is that it opened up the possibility that the Monroe Doctrine that the United States had enforced, that doctrine established in 1823 that required all European countries to abstain from further involvement in the Americas, that the United States would no longer be able to enforce this. And so the French, under their emperor, Napoleon III, invaded Mexico in order to establish a French puppet state called the Second Mexican Empire. That state had a number of Mexican rebels that it was trying to oppose, primarily led by the former government of Mexico. And it just happened that at that time in Mexico, there were areas that were densely forested and tropical, areas that French troops had immense difficulty navigating in. Accordingly, Napoleon III reached out to Said Pasha and said, could you send me some of those slave soldiers from the Sudan, presuming that those soldiers would be able to deal with the temperature. And Said Pasha sent 447 of these soldiers. He was asked to send 1,500, but he couldn't spare that many. And those soldiers served with distinction for the French Empire, for the Second Mexican Empire in Mexico, and were renowned for their service by both the French and Algerian Zouaves, among whom they served, and the Mexicans against whom they fought. So after Said Pasha died in 1863, he was succeeded by Ismail. This is a different Ismail than the one that conquered the Sudan. And this Ismail was a individual with a plan to really develop and culture Egypt. And he did this through numerous large-scale developments. The first is that he built numerous canals to increase irrigation. It's estimated that he built roughly 13,000 kilometers of irrigation canals based off the Nile in order to increase the amount of arable territory that Egypt possessed. He also used this to build massive sugar plantations and to centralize the sugar industry. He also improved significant parts of the communication apparatus within Egypt. In fact, he built so many railroads that he had more railroad per capita of citizen than any of the European states. He built in both Egypt and the Sudan, although admittedly significantly more in Egypt. He also built over 8,000 kilometers of telegraph lines, really connecting most parts of the Egyptian state. He also worked significantly to improve the harbor in Alexandria and to make it capable of taking in large numbers of ships, and for developing a larger navy than even Muhammad Ali had conceived. He built several major structures, including 3 unique palaces. You can see Abdin Palace, which was built in European style in the center. He also built the Khedivate Opera House, which opened in 1869. And he received numerous European dignitaries at both of these places. He also traveled to Europe on many occasions, becoming well acquainted with the high and mighty in Europe. And as you can imagine, all of this, and he built a significant new section for Europeans and other foreigners who were increasingly drawn to Egypt's modernization project by building an entire section of Cairo. He also, but his money spending didn't end there. He also wanted to build an empire and show that he, like the European states, could do what was prestigious in that time, which was build an empire. And so his first major invasion was to the west of the Sudan, into the Darfur region, which he was able to take with the help of local individuals like Zobeir Pasha. Zobeir Pasha was a governor in the Sudan, And he had become governor through the amassing of wealth, and that wealth was amassed through the trading of slaves. He was one of the largest slave traders in the entire region of the Sudan. And he was able to mobilize his slave armies in order to assist Ismail with the conquest of Darfur, which he intended to rule. That didn't end up happening. But until he was removed by the British, he was one of the more powerful individuals in the Sudan. Ismail then turned his attention to the Ethiopians on Sudan's eastern flank and began a war against Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia. Now, that invasion went south rather quickly. The Egyptians, despite being more numerous and better armed, were unfamiliar with Ethiopian terrain and geography, and so they would march through the Ethiopian highlands, going through thin mountain passes. The Ethiopians would surprise them and thoroughly defeat them. And so the only thing that Ismail could not abide was a loss. And so he followed good action by bad, and bad by worse. The Ethiopian War was responsible for at least half of the expenditure that Ismail ended up undertaking throughout the duration of his Khedivate. Now, in order to rule the Sudan effectively, he realized that he needed expertise. And while he could rely on some individuals like Zubair Pasha, who were indigenous individuals who could be governors, he wanted those with more governing experience. And given his relationship with Europeans, he invited numerous of them to administer the Sudan in his name. The most famous of these is Charles Gordon. He was called Charles Chinese Gordon as a result of his having put down a number of rebellions, including the Taiping Rebellion in China, at the behest of the British Empire. And so he became the governor of the Sudan from 1873 to 1880. There's a question. I heard Ethiopia has never been conquered by European or American forces. That's not true. We're going to talk about, or we might talk about the Ethiopian conquest in 1936, but it wasn't colonized, which is what's the usual thing, because people will see the map of 1914, and there are only two independent countries in Africa. Those are Liberia and Ethiopia, Liberia being a former American colony, but that was independent by 1914, and Ethiopia, which resisted the Italians. And we're going to talk a little bit about that to the extent that it's related to Egypt and the Sudan. So, but Charles Gordon from Britain was not the only person involved in the running of this territory. In fact, we have several individuals. In particular, you have Mehmet Amin and Rudolf von Schlatten. Both of these individuals, although Mehmet Amin, you can't tell by his name, were born as German-speaking Catholics. Both had Jewish parents, a Jewish father in each case, but these people were both raised Catholic. Rudolf von Schlatten converted to Islam in the later period during the Mahdist Revolt. It's unclear whether Mehmet Amin ever actually did. But both of them served as governors, recording their situation within the Sudan and discussing how to better organize the territory and pacify it. Additionally, they tried, and this is why Zubair Pasha became inimical to them, they tried to abolish or minimize the slave trade that was existing in the region. So, you're probably asking yourself, where did Ismail get all the money to spend on all of these things that he's been doing between modernizing the country, building everything? He finished the Suez Canal. He was leading wars of attempted conquest in Ethiopia. Well, it turns out that he increased the debt from £3 million sterling when he assumed office to £96 million by the time that the British finally put a stop to all of the lending that they'd been doing to him. Now, the British and French, because he'd been taking out loans from both, sent a commission led by Goshen on the British side and Joubert on the French side to evaluate what was going on with all of this spending. And the response that they came to was that Ismail simply didn't understand how credit worked. And while that may be sad, it meant that he could no longer be in power, or else he would continue to waste the country's money. And so the British began a project to assume some of the debt that Ismail owed in exchange for shares that Ismail had of the Suez Canal, and to remove him from power, so that way they could put somebody in that position who would be more amenable to tightening the belt. However, during that process, there was a French commissioner and a British commissioner that would be involved in watching and controlling the financial expenditures until that replacement could be brought in. And that replacement was Khedive Tawfiq. Tawfiq was a pushover of a man. So as Ismail was ejected and he went into exile in Italy, Tawfiq became the new ruler of Egypt, at least in name. But in actuality, Lord Cromer, whose true name is Evelyn Baring, came from the British side to assert the dual control, and Marquis Ernest de Binière on the French side came to do this. And so it was really they who controlled Egypt at this point. And so Egypt shifts from being a territory that is a vassal of the Ottomans to declaring an independent Khedivate in 1867, to then in 1876 effectively becoming what will be termed the Veiled Protectorate, meaning that it's under foreign control, despite the fact that there is still a Khedive in power. But these foreign agents in the financial department begin to choose how they're going to organize the government, and they promote politicians who are more in line with their way of thinking, tightening the budget in a number of different respects. Probably the biggest respect in which the budget was tightened was the military. They cut down significantly on the size of the military from 1874 to 1879, and they were responsible for avoiding any new infrastructure developments other than canals that could be led to increased agriculture. Now, Egypt under this period had begun to try and move towards a constitutional monarchy from being a more absolutist monarchy. And part of that was the creation of the Council of Deputies. In the very beginning, it reported to Ismail and gave him information about what would go on and provided advisory services. But increasingly, as we move towards as we move towards a change in the Egyptian political structure, they become more and more capable of voting on processes and things to submit to Khedive Tawfiq. That said, there was criticism on all sides, and nobody expressed that more clearly than Yaqub Sanwar, who was a Jewish Egyptian. He was living abroad in France at the time, so he could publish newspapers that would have been completely illegal to publish in Egypt. He was very famous for his satirical cartoons, as well as publishing in the Egyptian dialect, as opposed to publishing in modern standard Arabic, meaning that most Egyptians could understand what he was talking about. And he criticized Ismail's egregious spending. He criticized the British attempts to control the country, and he criticized Khedive Tawfiq for being generally weak and submissive. And Egyptians generally agreed with these criticisms, and there were protests throughout the country, not the least of which came from the army, given that so many military officers were now without a job. One of these military officers was one of the highest ranking native Egyptians in the military. He was a colonel. That's Ahmed Urabi. And Urabi, he began to unify the various different corps, both military and civilian, in opposition to the Sultan, in opposition to the Khedive. Now, Khedive Tawfiq reached out to the historic country to which Egypt owed fealty. That was the Ottoman Empire. So he reached out to Sultan Abdul Hamid II and requested that Abdul Hamid II send Ottoman troops to crush the revolt. Abdul Hamid hesitated, given that he didn't want to directly interact with those European groups that were in control of Egypt. And Urabi also asked Sultan Abdul Hamid II to dethrone Tawfiq, and at the same time, Sultan Abdul Hamid stayed neutral. He said that he did not want to involve himself in Egyptian affairs. And the Urabi Revolt was very controversial among the various different sectors of the society. Now, the general Egyptian population, the vast majority of people, especially the poor falah or peasant farmers, these individuals were very much supporting Urabi's government. Remember, Urabi is himself ethnic Egyptian, and he is able to motivate the crowd because he seems like an earnest broker. He seems like a person who is standing up for the rights of the Egyptian people. He also gets most of the discharged members of the military to join with him, those who are angry that they've lost their paycheck. And he also manages to reach out to the Copts, the large Christian minority population. Now, the Copts make up about 10 to 15% of the Egyptian population. And by and large, Urabi tried to get his forces to leave the Copts alone. That didn't always happen. There were altercations, because in many ways, the Copts were seen as supporters of the Europeans and that they shared a religion. But by and large, the Copts supported Urabi, and Urabi ordered his men to not attack the Copts and not consider them as foreigners. Those that opposed the religion were generally the established governing powers, the European officials, like those dual control leaders that we saw before, the various landowners, the neo-Mamluks who had been integrated into the governing apparatus of the Khedive, and Syrian Christians, that is, Christians who came from Syria and generally integrated with the upper classes. So Tawfiq ends up giving in to the rebellion and creates a constitutional monarchy government. There's no actual constitution, but he appoints Urabi as Minister of War, and he sets up a government that he will be responsive to. But this is unacceptable to the Europeans. So in January of 1882, Urabi becomes Minister of War under a new government that Khedive Tawfiq is setting up. And as part of this government, he is going to remove the presence of those European dual controls. And it's very likely that he will nationalize the Suez Canal. Both of these are unacceptable to the British and the French, who have significant amounts invested, especially since the British had now taken Ismail's debt investment. And so they begin to send ships to Alexandria. At that point, they invite, this is in July, they invite Khedive Tawfiq to come and to seek refuge with them, which he does outside of Alexandria. And as the British ships are nearing the city, there's a mass riot that occurs. Muslims attack many of the minorities in Alexandria. Alexandria has a significantly larger Christian population than most other cities in Egypt, especially Greeks and Copts and Armenians. And those populations are attacked for theoretically colluding with the Europeans. There are also European areas and quarters in the city where Europeans live there without even speaking Arabic. And so those areas get attacked. And so the trips offshore use that as justification to begin bombarding the city. They also sell it to their own populations that the only reason that they came to Alexandria was these riots. But the timetable simply doesn't make sense because they left Europe much, much earlier. It coincides with Urabi's becoming the defense minister. There's a question here. So it sounds like the European powers were primarily interested in having a cooperative resource and trade asset with Egypt without allowing it to develop too much as an independent power, while the Ottomans were relatively content with peaceful coexistence that relationship incidentally maintained. I think the Ottoman Empire, if it could have done what the European powers were doing now, would have done it. During the 300 years of Ottoman rule before Muhammad Ali, there was no development of Egypt in any serious sense. So it's just the only reason that Egypt was able to do, quote, its own thing, end quote, under the Ottomans was that the Ottomans couldn't exercise any control over Egypt, and it was only because of the great powers that Egypt just didn't dethrone the Ottomans to begin with and take over the entire Ottoman Empire. So, but yes, the Europeans absolutely were trying to turn Egypt into a resource generator and remove its ability to be a power in its own right. After the bombardment of Alexandria, British troops began to make landfall. At the same time, Ahmed Urabi, as Minister of War, was going to the various tribal units within Egypt and trying to bring together a military. And they encountered an armored train leaving Alexandria at the area of Kafr Dawar. At that area, they successfully defeated what the British claimed was a scouting force, and so that group retreated back to the coast. In fact, as you can see sort of from this map in the lower right-hand side, after arriving in Kafr Dawar, the British went around the coast and decided to go in through the canal, making landfall at Ismailia and encountering the Egyptian troops at Tel el-Kebir. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir then happened on the 13th of September. The Egyptians spotted the British just as the sun was rising at 5:45 in the morning, and they shelled that location. That said, the British were able to go over the hastily made fortifications. The Egyptians were not expecting an attack from the Suez, and so they hadn't prepared as effectively as they had along the Nile Delta, which is why Kafr ad-Dawar was so much more successful. And by the end of the day, the British had killed over 2,000 Egyptians, sustaining more losses to heat stroke than to actual Egyptian firearms. And the way towards Cairo was clear without any further Egyptian obstacles. So when the British arrived in Cairo, they reinstated Khedive Tawfiq as the Khedive of the empire. Urabi was taken into exile to the island of Sri Lanka, which was a British colony at the time. So that way he couldn't galvanize another rebellion. And the British decided that they would take a much more direct approach in terms of governing Egypt. So when they take power in 1882, the way that they decide to rule the country is very much in accordance with what is typically considered the white man's burden, as Richard Kipling explained it. In particular, Lord Cromer was known for being a believer that subject races, those peoples who are not European, were people that could never be able to self-govern. And so therefore, the British would need to carry them along on the road to civilization. And in fact, many Egyptians in the early part of the Veiled Protectorate thought that the British were going to improve them and then leave. And they were relatively okay with that. There were some nationalist movements that were stirring at this period. But it's not until the late 1890s that we really begin to see a codified opposition to the British, when it became increasingly clear that the British weren't going anywhere. And what Lord Cromer did is he kept Khedive Tawfiq's system organized, and he also appointed ministers to the various ministries from the Egyptian population and from foreigners, but mostly from the Egyptian population, ministers that he thought he could control and would comply with British directives, and he would remove those who did not. He also disbanded the entire Egyptian army, given how Urabi had been able to radicalize it against the British, and created a whole new army that would be entirely loyal to the British based on the Askari system that was used in other British countries. The one thing he was willing to spend money on, as I pointed out, was irrigation projects. And the other thing is that he had experience in India, where education led to Indians getting undesirable thoughts in their mind of independence and rebellion. And so he made schools less and less possible for Egyptians. He closed down a number of secondary schools, and he raised the tuition rates of elementary school in order to deter people from getting education. Another thing, and we're going to sort of talk about it when we talk about the Sudan, is that he made the difficult decision that most in the Khedivate would have been loath to make, which was to allow the Mahdists to take Sudan and for Egypt to no longer control it. Control of the Sudan, of course, was part of how Egypt legitimated itself through its own prestige and honor. And so the loss of the Sudan to the Mahdists, which we're going to talk about, was very much a blow to Egyptian national morale. Now, one other thing that we should talk about is the Deshaway incident, which occurred in 1906. It was a situation where there was an altercation between a British soldier and some peasants, which resulted in the British rounding up 42 peasants and executing them without any meaningful discussion of whether they were complicit in the attack, whether there were provoking incidents. And so the skulls and dead bodies of those people became seen as martyrs in demonstrating the falsity of the British claim that they were there to help Egyptians. So turning back to the Sudan, right? Egypt has colonized this territory. Under Ismail, you have a number of governorates that are existing in the region. But we should talk about what the culture of the Sudan was at this period. Probably the dominant form of Islam that exists in the Sudan is Sufism. And it exists there because it plays into many of the magic and spiritual traditions that existed in a lot of the African religions that still survived in especially the areas in the southern part of Sudan, but was Islamic, and so therefore was acceptable to the leaders who are more Arab aligned. So you end up with this situation where you have a number of different Sufi schools that exist, and their populations are called dervishes. In this milieu of a lot of death and loss, oppressive taxation from the Egyptians, you begin to have Sudanese who want to resist, Sudanese who want to develop as an independent country or independent set of countries. And so into this world, one Samniya Sufi comes to the fore named Muhammad Ahmed. Now, Muhammad Ahmed argues that the Sudanese need to stand together against the oppression, and he eventually attracts so much interest that he's expelled from the Samniya, and he begins to form his own group of Sufis who follow him, his own dervishes. And you can see a Mahdi dervish. They dressed in very simple clothes. And in fact, the teaching of the Mahdi was that what had motivated the Egyptians to lose their Islamic penchant for good deeds, right? Because they had to contend with the fact that the Egyptians who had oppressed them, or the Turks who had oppressed them, either way, were Muslims. And so they had to explain how Muslims could act in a way that was so unjust and unrighteous. And so the Muhammad Ahmed claimed that the reason that this had happened was they valued material wealth and material prosperity. And so the true follower of Islam should reject these things and live an austere life. So he dressed very simply, so did his followers. And in many senses, you can a person who's familiar with Catharism can compare this to the Cathar faith. And Muhammad Ahmed was a genuine believer. He went from town to town preaching about austerity, about love of country, about defense, and about the difficulties of living under the Egyptians, including the slave trade to the degree it still existed, all these different things. And he managed to amass an army behind him. And that army was composed of a number of other contingents as well. So probably his biggest contingent were the Baggara Arabs. The Baggara are a tribe of self-declared Arabs. They, in many cases, they are Africans, so significantly darker than what we think of as Arabs. But they were known for being effective cavalry, and they had large numbers, and so they became the backbone of Muhammad Ahmad's forces, and they began to follow him with a religious zeal because they believed he was the Mahdi. And it's worth taking a second to explain what the Mahdi is. In Islamic eschatology, the end of days, Muslims believe that there will be a return of the Messiah, of Jesus, and there will be a great fight, the victory of which will go to the Muslims, and Jesus will declare that he is a Muslim, and that, of course, that the Christians were wrong about him, the Muslims were right about him, and so forth. But before Jesus arrives, there will be a harbinger to tell of this coming person, very similar to Elijah in the Jewish tradition, or John the Baptist in the Christian tradition. This is a person who will come before the Messiah and tell everybody that the Messiah is on his way. And the Mahdi is this expected person in Islamic eschatology. So Muhammad Ahmad accepted this title of the Mahdi, that he was the way, who was the person who was going to prepare the world for the return of the Messiah. And so he began numerous expansionary wars against the Egyptians and the British governors who represented them. So in 1884, Governor Gordon, who had been removed in 1881 because of the Urabi Revolt, was sent back to Khartoum in order to extricate all foreigners from the city as the Mahdists were moving on Khartoum. Instead, he decided to lead a gallant defense of the city, and it wasn't until the 26th of January in 1885 that the Mahdists broke into the city and murdered everybody in the city, including Charles Gordon, who was celebrated in British halls as having fallen for king and country. There were some smaller expeditions that tried to hold back the Mahdist state, including, for example, there was an expedition led by a number of British designed to relieve Charles Gordon because of how long he managed to hold out. And that group was ambushed before they made their way to Khartoum on the 17th of January at Abu Tleh. The British mispronounced the name of this area as Abu Kleh, and wrote many poems about it. It was while the British were able to make it past this fight, they were not able to arrive at the city until after it had already fallen, and so there was nothing to do in Khartoum but just retreat. The Suwakin expedition managed to arrive from India, and you can see that a significant number of the soldiers there are Indian. Suwakin is a city on the Red Sea, and that expedition was able to hold on to the city and prevent the Mahdists from getting access to the sea. And you can see the Mahdist state, to the extent that it was a contiguous territory, was entirely landlocked. So when I say in 1885 that the British decided to accept that the Mahdists had taken over the Sudan, this is what they were accepting, that this revolutionary group with pretensions of power was now in control of the Sudan. Muhammad Ahmad himself didn't really survive that long after. He died 6 months after the fall of Khartoum, and so power transferred to his chosen successor, Abdullahi ibn Muhammad, who became the new caliph of this state. And it's what scholars tend to call a jihad state, meaning that it is a state that derives significant portions of its revenue from Islamic holy war declared against enemy states. Now, those states can be Muslim or Christian. And the declaration of war against other Muslims is quite common because of the process of takfir, or the declaring of others as unbelievers. And as we've discussed in Wahhabism, and you can see it also in Mahdism, the penitents of this faith believe that they have the ability to declare as kafir or unbeliever members of what are ostensibly Muslim groups. This is something that is not a general view in mainstream Islamic theology. So Abdullah ibn Muhammad began to centralize the territory through the creation of a number of different state entities. The first is that he began to administer taxes and administer taxes and make his own coins. And you can see that there are still coins that bear the mark of the Mahdist state that exists today. He also standardized the court system, building numerous Sharia courts in the various regions of the Sudan. Now, we have to remember that prior to the Egyptian conquest, the Sudan was made up of a number of different tribes that the Egyptians had managed to conquer, but these were still different and distinct tribes with numerous historical enmities, differences in culture and language. And so the attempt to centralize the country was angered significantly a number of the coalition partners that had been part of the Mahdist state. Another thing that alienated these groups is that Abdullah ibn Muhammad tended to rely significantly on the Baghera, right? We've talked about them, this sort of Arab African group, but the Baghera made up maybe 10% of the coalition. Not that other members were bigger, most other members of the coalition were smaller, but the fact that he kept rewarding Baghera with members in the ministry and the ministries that he was using to control the territory alienated a number of the other groups. There's a question of, so now they're tracking away from the earlier secular justice innovations and reverting more to traditional Islam. No, the Mahdist himself was traditional. He just didn't have the infrastructure to administer these kinds of things because he was in the middle of forming the state. He was a very pious person, and the people who followed him were pious as well. They prayed, they declared their actions of war against the Egyptian government as jihad. They were involved in numerous religious behaviors. They built mosques. The only difference is that Abdullah ibn Muhammad was presiding over a unified state, whereas Ahmed Muhammad was the Mahdi himself, was presiding over a state in formation. There were numerous wars declared against the few Europeans and other groups of Egyptians that hadn't quite surrendered in the territory, such as Shlatin. He fought, he fought a losing war against, he fought a losing war against Abdullah ibn Muhammad and was taken prisoner in 1883. In fact, he survived in captivity for 11 years, and when he was finally able to escape through Ethiopia, he recorded all of his memories in his famous book, Fire and Sword in the Sudan, where he discussed the internal workings and what he saw as a slave in the court of Caliph Abdullah ibn Muhammad. But it wasn't just against the Egyptians that the Mahdists fought under Abdullah ibn Muhammad. They fought against numerous other groups as well. The Mahdist state was in perpetual attempt to expand as a jihadist state. And so the Mahdist military began moving against all adversaries. They confiscated from the government in Khartoum a number of steamboats. And so you can see the steamboat Bourdain. That was originally a British steamer that the Mahdists took and used in their attack on Egypt in 1889. In particular, in 1889. That attack was rebuffed by a British trained Egyptian military, And after that, the Mahdists avoid trying to go after Egypt. But there were still numerous groups that they could go after. The first one that they went after, because of its proximity, was Ethiopia. And they invaded Ethiopia several times. They had about as much success as Ismail had. There were numerous battles spread out across the years. The Ethiopians had to fight hard against the Mahdists, while were able to keep their border. In fact, the declaration of war against Ethiopia was in many cases related to the fact that if you look at the Mahdist state, there's that area of Equatoria, which is south of it, and was an area where a number of British administrators had been completely cut off from Egypt. Mehmet Amin, for example, was one of those who was in Equatoria. And the Ethiopians had struck a deal with the British to allow those people to escape Africa through their territory to the city of Zeila, which was under British occupation at the time on the Gulf of Aden. And so the Mahdists declared war on Ethiopia, using that as a pretext. As I said, the Ethiopians rebuffed them. Another attack came from the Belgian Congo, where the Belgians saw the opportunity, with the British leaving that area, of possibly expanding their colonial territory. And so they invaded Equatoria, only to encounter the Mahdists defending it. At the Battle of Rajaf, they were able to defeat the Mahdists and force them out of Equatoria. You also had attempts to invade Eritrea, which was an Italian colony. And so the Italians fought back at several battles, finally achieving success in the middle 1890s with the Battle of Tokrov. There's a question as to whether Magdala in Ethiopia is named after Mary Magdalene. I don't know. And there's another point that the Belgian invasion of the Congo was particularly violent and brutal. In order to read about that, you can see King Leopold's Ghost. Absolutely. The repression in the Congo was horrendous. And in particular, these battles against the Mahdists were similarly horrendous. Now, you can see that with the Italian successes at Tokrov and the Belgian successes in Equatoria, it was increasingly looking to the British like other European states, and the French also were beginning to launch attacks. The British felt that the Mahdists would eventually capitulate, and they would capitulate to somebody else, and they could not afford for a different colonial power to take power in the Sudan. They would need to do it themselves. And so they sent Herbert Kitchener to do this. He was considered a very effective Arab linguist. He spoke several different dialects of Arabic, and he understood military tactics better than pretty much any other leader in the empire. As he was deployed, at the same time, the Italians were trying to advance on Ethiopia and include Ethiopia within their territory. They were substantially defeated at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, when the Ethiopians asserted their own power. But the Ethiopians were not going to invade the Sudan. They had had enough with the various Sudanese wars that had happened. And the Italians, in order to save face, decided to forego their invasion of the Sudan and give any territories in Sudan that they had taken over to the British in return for material support. So Kitchener realized very early on that if he was going to bring soldiers into the Sudan and they were going to be effective, he was going to need to build a railroad that would be able to bypass the river and the areas that could be most effectively policed and controlled by the Mahdists. And under heavy fire, he was able to get this railroad built using Egyptian corvée labor. It was a painstaking operation, and as I said, many Egyptians, at many points, the Mahdists came and raided, and so the railroad had to be defended as it was under construction. That said, when it was constructed, Herbert Kitchener was able to bring his forces due south to the center of the Mahdist territories, where he could then begin to deploy. Now, the majority of his forces were Sudanese Egyptian soldiers. So these had been individuals who had been brought up from the Sudan before the Sudan fell to the Mahdists and were now in his care. They knew of the conditions, and Kitchener himself was a very effective strategist. He prosecuted a war, he prosecuted an effective battle against Omdurman, which is a city near Khartoum that the Mahdists had used as their capital. And Caliph Abdullahi ibn Muhammad fled. He was finally found a year and a half later in the city of Kosti, far to the south, where he was captured by the British and executed in order to prevent the regime, the Mahdist regime, from sprouting again. There's a question of what was Italy after in terms of Ethiopia? Prestige. There are a number of minerals that exist in Ethiopia, but the real goal was prestige. Italy had very few colonial possessions, and having more colonial possessions would have made it look better in the eyes of Europeans. It would also physically unite the colony they had in the southern part of Somalia and their colony in Eritrea. There's a question of how many years and months. I believe it took about a year and a half for him to build the railroad. So after the after the British were able to take Sudan, they established it as what they called an Anglo-Egyptian condominium of the Sudan. And that territorial organization would last until 1956. It was primarily ruled by the British and attached to Egypt, but it would have its own governance separate from that of Egypt. Another thing that the British did in terms of their governance is that they separately governed the three southernmost territories, those that today comprise the country of South Sudan, owing to their different religious nature and their different, ethnic organization. There are very few Arabs in that region. So as a result of the British division of these two regions, you begin to have governance in those regions that looks somewhat different, despite them still both being part of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. So now we get to the question of Egyptian culture. So we discussed in episode 30 about Rifa'at al-Tahtawi, and al-Tahtawi believed in what he called what he and others have called Muslim modernism or Islamic modernism. This is the belief that Islam itself created the apparatus for people to achieve maximal human flourishing. And the problem in the Islamic world is that people are using dogmatic rules in order to limit development, in order to limit the way that society should be structured. And in truth, what should happen is that Muslims should embrace science, should embrace modern technology, because those are themselves the fruits of the human mind, which God has given to man. In fact, At-Tahtawi indicated that there are 5 basic freedoms that any Muslim state should support. And these look very similar to the freedoms that exist in Europe. In fact, At-Tahtawi and other Muslim modernists were inspired by the European freedoms that existed, such as freedom of conscience, freedom to engage in politics, freedom to behave or to have any religious manifestation that they wanted. And this became part of the Nahda, or the Renaissance. There's a question of, were there any particular countries that were particularly coveted to be invaded? By the 1880s, pretty much everywhere in the world that quote should have been invaded, end quote, was invaded. So at that point, you're just sort of looking for scraps. In the very beginning, of course, Egypt was very highly prized because of its access to the Suez. India was prized because of its large numbers of inhabitants and spices. So was Indonesia for the same reason. China was desirable because of its production. So there certainly were places that were more desirable than others. Yeah. And At-Tahtawi was responsible for creating some of the first major presses in Egypt, like the Bulaq press, which he used to publish his newspaper discussing Egyptian society. And this Renaissance, as we've discussed in the case of the Levant region, really hinged around this concept of Arab nationalism as defined in the region of the Levant. Arab nationalism doesn't really have a strong pull in Egypt, certainly not until the 1940s and 50s. So what's dominant is this Islamic modernism. And we've talked about Rifa'i Tahtawi. Namik Kemal and Jamal ad-Din Afghani are Muslim modernists outside of Egypt, but Muhammad Abduh is also a modernist in the Egyptian context, and he is involved in facilitating the growth of science and technology in Egypt. His famous quote is, I went to Europe and I saw no Muslims, but I saw Islam. And when I returned to Egypt, I saw many Muslims, but I saw no Islam, referring to the context of Egypt being a country where the mental fruits were not allowed to be discovered. And in fact, Abduh was very sympathetic to various different forms of Islam. While he criticized certain excesses among the Sufis, in his view, he had no animus towards Sunnis or Shiites. He had numerous outreaches to the Copts as well, all right, the Christian minority. He had some objections to Europeans being in Egypt, certainly, but by and large, he viewed a Muslim state as being modern, tolerant, and forward-thinking. But Islamic modernism really didn't survive much past the 1920s. And so when we're going to talk about this cultural stuff, we're talking sort of in a time between 1890 and 1930, right? We're sort of moving in that space. We're going to move through it rather fluidly because cultural things, of course, are occurring contemporaneously, and there's sometimes they go forward, sometimes they go back. But Islamic modernism really seems to fail around 1910 or so. And you begin to see a new wave of Egyptians addressing sort of the fallout. And the fallout goes one of two ways. There are those who believe that Islam doesn't really have a place in governance, and so the governance should be secular as opposed to inspired by Islam, but it should still propose modernity and advancement and development. And there's the view that Islam absolutely has a place in government, but modernity will inexorably lead towards secularism. And so you need to prevent that development, prevent that sense of forward-looking identity in order to create a Muslim society. And so among the secularists, you have Ali Abd al-Razik and Taha Hussein. Both of these individuals are responsible for pioneering new ways of understanding states. In the case of Abd al-Razik, he famously wrote after the removal by Ataturk of the caliphate, as we discussed in episode 50. And this was a startling blow in the Arab world for there to no longer be a Sunni caliph. And there were questions in the Arab world, especially in Egypt, of should a new caliph be created or declared. And very few of them were supportive of the Sharif of Mecca when he did this in 1924. So what should happen? And Abd al-Razik said, we don't need a caliph. It's better, in fact, if Islam is entirely divorced from the apparatus of government. It allows the government to govern without impinging on people's religious beliefs, and it allows people to have religious beliefs that are not corrupted through political policy. And so that division between those two entities, the state and the religion, was very important to him in developing Egypt. Taha Hussein was is probably Egypt's most famous philosopher. He was born blind, and learned how to read and write his own discourses through people talking to him and reading books to him. He's an absolutely phenomenal intellect. And he wrote this book you can see here, which is Fi Sha'ar al-Jahili, or in the poetry of the Jahiliyyah period. The Jahiliyyah period, or the ignorant period, refers to the period in Arabia before Islam. And there was a view that existed in Islamic culture that there was numerous poetry that was recited and created both prior to and after Islam. But Taha Hussein did research into that poetry and argues in this book that that poetry was much more likely a fabrication in later centuries to create a milieu in which to find the Quran. He also debated whether certain aspects, and accordingly, this was seen as a veiled criticism of the Quran itself and its divinity. Taha Hussein famously was brought in front of an Egyptian court for his act of blasphemy in the Egyptian equivalent of Galileo's trial. But unlike that one, Taha Hussein was found to be innocent because the court reasoned that he was speaking strictly from the perspective of a scientific mind and was not stating any personal opinions. On the other side of the coin, the Islamists argued that the failure of the modern state is that it is not fused to the Islamic structure. And this movement really started in Egypt under Hassan al-Banna, who had as his own influence Rashid Reza in Syria. Now, Reza had argued that, significantly speaking, Muhammad Abdu was wrong to be so tolerant. That in fact, this tolerance of various perspectives and viewpoints prevents people from governing from a moral purpose. And Hassan al-Banna ran with that and created an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood that would bring Muslims together with the goal of instantiating Sharia as the official law of Egypt, along with the creation of a jihadist state, in much the way that the Mahdists had been, where the Muslim Brotherhood would declare war on other states and bring them in line with their understanding of Islam. Because of the influence of Reza, the view of the Muslim Brotherhood was much more narrow in scope than the previous Sunni traditions, even of Egypt, had been. It was highly critical of both Shiites and of Sufis, and the group was increasingly hostile towards the Egyptian government, which put them under heavy surveillance. The question is asking, is the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist group? At this point, they're not doing enough violently in order to be a terrorist group, but they are definitely leaning in that direction. Yeah. But those aren't the only two philosophies that exist in Egypt. And probably the dominant one in the 19-teens and the 1920s is Egyptian nationalism. And the most ardent advocate of that is Mustafa Kamel. He was an ardent Francophile and believed that the Egyptians should govern themselves from the perspective that of mirroring French culture and society. But we really have to understand a little bit more about where he's coming from. So we have the pyramids, and the pyramids, of course, existed in Egypt at this time, and they had existed in Egypt for thousands of years. But the understanding of what they were was quite minimal. Remember that it wasn't until the 1820s that the hieroglyphs in Egypt were decoded. And even then, the information was retained primarily by students in Europe. Egyptians, by and large, didn't have a sense of connection to the ancient Egyptians. This was part of that Jahiliyyah, that ignorant period before Islam, and therefore not relevant. In fact, during the Islamic control of Egypt from the 600s onwards, numerous stories had cropped up in order to save the pyramids that they were somehow connected with Islam, that they had something to do with some Sufi group or some historical group, that they were built by one Muslim ruler or another. And these views circulated among the common people in order to prevent them from being destroyed. There was also this, the pyramids might have some magical talismans in them that could kill people if they were destroyed. And so Muslim Egyptians, by and large, left the pyramids alone. But they didn't see them as a source of identity or of pride. They were just a thing that was in the landscape, not much different than how Americans might see random mountains in the Rockies or the Adirondacks. In comparison, for example, with native tribes, which may venerate or not certain mountains. So a realization began to happen by individuals like Mustafa Kemal that, in fact, Egypt is a continuation of that ancient empire, that modern Egypt is the descendant of ancient Egypt, and not necessarily simply a country created by the repeated conquests of the territory. And many individuals who were in support of this began to call that ideology pharaonism, or respect to the pharaohs, right? Because they're taking ownership of that past in Egypt. Mustafa Kemal, in addition to speaking fluent French, which got him around European social circles, was able to discuss what it meant to be an Egyptian in a modern social and political context, which created a sense for many poor Egyptians what Egyptianness was and how they had it. And it wasn't just this that Mustafa Kemal harped on. He was very much aware in 1905 of the Japanese victory over the Russians, and he saw Japan as a real inspiration, as a country that had not given up on its Japaneseness in order to modernize, but instead was able to modernize and defeat Westerners in creating its own authority. And he became a massive Japanophile, even arguing things as absurd as the Japanese occupation of Korea was something that was lovely and peaceful and indicative of the Japanese higher mentality, ignoring, of course, that the Koreans probably felt about the same as the Egyptians did under imperialist control. Other individuals also claimed to be Egyptian nationalists. Murad Farag was an Egyptian Jew in, I believe, Alexandria. And he published numerous papers supporting both the vision that Jews had for Palestine of Zionism. We'll talk more about his Zionist leanings next week. But he also supported Egyptian nationalism and believed that as an Egyptian, his state was Egypt. Other Jews may need Palestine, but he believed that Jews were part of that centuries and millennia long history of Egypt. Their fate was tied with the fate of Muslim and Christian Egyptians. You can also see that there's a question of, did he also say that Japanese chemical and biological poisoning of the Chinese populace was acceptable? I don't think he was alive during World War II. I'd have to check when he died. But he was very limited in his information about the East, but what he did know was that Japan had prevailed, and that to him was the key takeaway from Japan. Pharaonists disagreed as to the extent that Arabness had something or anything to do with Egyptian identity. There were those like Mustafa Kemal who argued that the Arab nature of Egypt today is purely incidental, and what should carry through from the past is sort of this pharaonic culture. Taha Hussein disagreed, arguing that Arabness was certainly part of the Egyptian fabric and should be recognized as such. And so you had this massive debate within the world, within the Egyptian nationalist world, about to what degree is Egypt the descendants of the pharaohs, and to what degree is Egypt the modern cosmopolitan society that exists today, and what the threading connection was between the two. There was also an incredible confluence of factors that led to Egypt discovering part of its own heritage in real time, which was, of course, the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by British Egyptologist Carter, at the financial backing of Lord Carnarvon. Now, one of the things that had existed during the early Egyptology period under the Alawiyya dynasty is that the Alawiyya didn't really care about Egypt's past. And so British and French, who had excavated in the territory, simply took whatever they found and brought it back to their museums in their home countries. But with the rise of Pharaonism, leaders like Saad Zaghlul, who was one of the leaders of the Waft movement, the delegation proposing independence, this was now a point on which Egyptian culture could turn. This was part now of Egypt's history, not something just from the Jahiliyyah, the ignorant period. And so you can see, Saad Zaghlul actually exhibited a number of the artifacts that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb in Luxor, creating the largest crowd that city had ever seen. And the Egyptian press made quite clear that Tutankhamun was connected with the modern Egyptian zeitgeist. You can see in that cartoon that the mummy is pointing to Lord Carnarvon, telling him and all foreign usurpers to get out of Egypt and to bring back to her the best ruler that Egypt has. This was, of course, referring to the fact that Saad Zaghlul, when this comic was printed, was actually in exile, held by the British and Malta, in order to prevent him from moving Egypt closer and closer towards independence. And his return from exile is in the second clip, where you can see him slowly limping down the stairs, and a cat that's representative of the British government in Egypt being afraid of his arrival. One of the other things that that people really don't realize about the role of women in Egypt is that women in Egypt began to cultivate centers of learning themselves. And these centers of learning were called the salons. Now, salons have a long history in Arab culture, even predating Islam, where women would gather together and speak literature to one another, because in the Arab world, most literature was oral. But these salons became areas where the high and mighty in the cultural sense, as well as the political sense, could mix and mingle and talk. Nazle Fazl, who was one of the princesses of the Alawiyya dynasty, hosted salons in her own apartment. Most of these salons were male only, her being accepted, of course. But they would meet, and from the period that she was princess, she was able to facilitate relations between leaders like Muhammad Abduh and the British authorities, which had tried to expel him, removed him, but she convinced them to allow him back, and numerous other rather lampoonishly, she was able to advocate on behalf of Muhammad Abduh and other individuals from the Egyptian side. But on the same token, she was able to facilitate British individuals reaching over the line and making long-standing relations with the Egyptian power brokers. The other person here is May Ilyas Ziada. She was Palestinian, if we can use that term anachronistically, a Palestinian Christian who grew up in the city of Nazareth, and she was actually an esteemed writing partner of Khalil Gibran. They never actually met in person, but if Khalil Gibran and May Ilyas Ziada could have been said to be married. I think that their relationship was certainly more than platonic in terms of the emotional weight that they carried for one another. She was quite famous for hosting in her father's house salons with both men and women, where she, every Tuesday night for over 20 years, well, for nearly 20 years, until her father died, and it would be unseemly for a young woman unmarried to host unrelated men in her house. But she would dress as various historical figures, literary figures, and she would cultivate centers of learning and discussion all around poetry and literature and history. And Egypt at this point was producing boatloads of all of these kinds of poetry, music, songs, everything. It was the heart of the Arab world in terms of this kind of production, and it still actually has that role today. There's a question about the salons of French society. France had salons in operation before Egypt had them in operation, but Arab culture has had them outside of Egypt prior to Muhammad in the Jahiliyyah period. There's a question. I've read that the Quran is really intended to be recited rather than read, and latter-day reading of it by Westerners accounts for a great deal of misunderstanding. Do you see any accuracy in that? I don't think the accuracy stems from the method of the reading being recited as opposed to read directly. I don't think there's any difference in transmission. Like you could talk about Romeo and Juliet the same way, right? Do you understand it if you read it? Yeah, it's pretty. It comes through, as opposed to if you watch it as a play. Now, a lot of the misunderstanding comes from the fact that the Quran does not provide context for the declarations that it makes. So it assumes a person is familiar with underlying tales and stories, and it serves as an analytical paper. So you can imagine something like an assignment given in a school today of like compare and contrast Moby Dick and the Scarlet Letter. And somebody writes, Hester Prynne has an A on her chest, and that signifies that she's adulterous. Who's Hester Prynne? What is this A? Is it on her chest? Like, is it a tattoo? Like, all these details you don't know from the way that it's just operating as if you already understand the context. And so that's the biggest source of misunderstandings of the Quran, is that Westerners read it as a book that is self-contained as opposed to a commentary on pre-existing traditions. All right. But we also see fantastic changes in Egyptian culture. Probably the easiest one to note is that the cities become incredibly cosmopolitan. We have people from all over the world in the major cities of Egypt. You have large numbers of different minorities. You have modern people, traditional people, everything is sort of mixed up together. French signs, in fact, French was an official language of Egypt until the abolition of the monarchy in 1952. And you have this sort of cultural confluence of many different kinds of people. You also, and two of these groups I want to point out in particular. There was a large Greek population that moved. Some of them were in Egypt since the days of the Ptolemies, right? 300 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians. And some were more recent, like those who had come in the later 19th century. But these Greeks lived in Egypt. They had their own Orthodox communities and their own Orthodox churches. They spoke Greek. They cooked Greek food. They were, for all intents and purposes, more Greek than you can say Greek Americans are. And the Greeks in Egypt were particularly well known for their investment in the shipping industry and their promulgation of trade and contacts all across the Mediterranean. A number of wealthy Greek families also served as intermediaries with European officials and that they knew several European languages and were respected more by Europeans for being seen as Europeans. The question is, why were Egyptians speaking French until 1952 when they were also invaded by the British? Given the Francophilic culture of the early Alawiya dynasty, right, we talked about how Muhammad Ali cultivated a strong relationship with the French in order to modernize his military, build engineering schools, all these things. And Said Pasha's relationship with the French, remember, he gave the French built the Suez Canal under his watch, and he sent Sudanese soldiers to fight for the French-supported the Second Mexican Empire. So you've got this strong relationship historically of Egypt with France. And that was especially the case because of Britain's support of the Ottoman Empire in the middle part of the 19th century. And because of the opposition between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire in those Egypt-Ottoman wars, the Egypt-French alliance deepened. And so French culture became very prominent in Egypt, to the point where many educated Egyptians spoke French. And the British, try as they might to remove French for English, they couldn't do it. The intelligentsia in Egypt was too Francophile for that to happen. And we can see that view sort of persisting. That's why, for example, Mustafa Kamil spoke French as a fluent language because of the prevalence of French in society. So you have those Egyptian Greeks. You also have Jews in Egypt. Yusuf Qatawi is probably the most famous of these. He actually was elevated to the rank of Pasha. And Qatawi is very famous for having created, along with a number of Egyptians, the Bank Misr. Bank Misr was the first Egyptian bank, in the sense that it was a bank run and operated by Egyptians as opposed to foreigners. There were a number of European banks, but there were no Egyptian banks in Egypt. European banks in Egypt, but there were no Egyptian banks in Egypt. And he, along with his Jewish and Muslim partners, were able to help fund the development of modern Egyptian businesses. In fact, despite the fact that Jews and Greeks together were about 4% of the population of Egypt, they were responsible for 50% of the businesses until 1956, when both of those populations fled the country. You also have the feminist movement. Probably the most famous Egyptian feminist from this period is Hoda Sha'arawi. As you can see there, following the 1920s, she refused to wear a veil in public. And at first, this alienated many people who were shocked to see a woman without covering her hair. But by the 1940s, it had actually become the dominant way that women dressed. Hoda Sha'arawi went to numerous feminist conventions throughout both Europe, Turkey, South America, numerous different places, and formulated questions about women's rights, especially in the domestic sphere, in order to improve the status of women throughout the country. Egypt had a vast literary tradition. I just want to pick out one individual here. That's Naguib Mahfouz. He was one of the only Egyptians who won the Nobel Prize. One or two others won, but he won the Nobel Prize in literature. And Naguib Mahfouz was part of that secular movement. He wrote about ancient Egypt, but he also wrote about modern Egypt, and he tried to create a bond that contextualized what Egyptian day-to-day life was. Many of his characters had lives in Cairo very similar to the lives of Egyptians in those days, and he gave cultural context for how those people were living and how they were understanding their new reality. And the last person I want to talk about here is Kulthum. Kulthum is probably the most famous singer in the history of Arab music, modern Arab music. She was raised as the daughter of a poor Sufi Egyptian, and she learned how to sing at her father's knee, more or less. And in fact, at that time, when she was very young, it was forbidden for women to sing religious songs. So her father actually dressed her up as a boy when she went out singing. As her voice developed, she became more and more desirable. She became a key actress in a number of Egyptian films, and her renditions of historic Arabic music were attended by millions in terms of concerts throughout the Arab world. In fact, she raised money for the Egyptian government by going on tour, and at one point she was able to raise $2 million in money at that time to donate to the Egyptian government, which was facing financial shortfalls and other issues. So you have this great development of culture and society working together here in Egypt. And unfortunately, we have come to the witching hour. So the rest of the stuff that I plan to talk about with Egypt, I'll push that to when I move further in time with Egypt, which is a lot. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. There's a question, wasn't there a specific name for French citizens born and raised in North Africa? I believe Yves Saint Laurent was of this culture ancestry. Yes, there is. Those are Pieds Noirs, or Piednoirs, right? Pieds Noirs, literally meaning black feet. But Pieds Noirs is a term that only applies to French settlers and their descendants, not French speakers, right? And so in Egypt, there were no French settlers. The people who were there were ethnic Egyptians. They just learned French because they considered it a marker of culture and society. There's a comment here that for modern Arabic music, I recommend Amr Diab. I absolutely agree. He's a great musician. He's a little more, he's an 80s, 90s kind of thing. So so young Egyptians aren't really listening to him, but older Egyptians, people my age, right, might. And he is Egyptian, so that's a part of the culture there. Now, I'm going to put the links in the chat so you can see all those things if you would like. And while I'm waiting for any last questions to come in, let me tell you a little bit more about our group. We're History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard Sassoon, and this is the Middle Eastern Islamic History, which we do every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. There are numerous other things that we do, like our discussions on Greco-Roman civilization. Jason Peng holds an Asian philosophy and Greco-Roman philosophy every Saturday and Monday at 7 p.m. respectively. Aaron and I do a series on European Union security that's been ongoing. We haven't scheduled one for November, but it's upcoming. Jane does a series on powerful women, and that's up every month. John Maloney on ancient languages. And we also have several short-run series, like the Russo-Ukrainian War series, which we've done several times. And we'll probably do, again, another episode in January or February. We also have older series that are there, and you can see all of that on our YouTube page. So one of the comments was that Egypt is expected to have a drought in 2025 because of the hydroelectric dam. Yes, Egypt is in a chronic position of having water issues and water control issues. So it doesn't surprise me that that a drought is possible. Now, somebody reminded me about the Ethiopia thing. Sure. So the current Ethiopia crisis sort of boils down like this. The modern country of Ethiopia was founded by primarily the Tigrayan minority. There was a degree to which that minority worked with other populations like the Amhara and Oromo. But by and large, the Tigrayans were the ones who created that country. More recently, the president of Ethiopia, who was not Tigrayan, he's Amhara, was trying to de-Tigrayify, if you can call it that, the government, make it more balanced between the different ethnicities, especially since the Tigray are smaller in terms of percentage. The Tigray community saw that as insulting, given the fact that they brought stability to the country and that they organized it well. And so they decided to try and declare autonomy. The national government led by the president decided that that level of autonomy was unacceptable. And so he launched an invasion of Tigrayan territory. And so there's a war now over control of autonomous Tigray territory and on the wider what the future of Ethiopia is going to be. The way that that war is being prosecuted is particularly gruesome, and Tigrayans argue that there are acts of ethnic cleansing going on. Patty, does that cover what you wanted about Ethiopia?
I think so. So was Haile Selassie, was he a Tigrayan or was he?
No. He was Amhara. But Haile Selassie wasn't the government that the Tigrayans were coming into. During the Cold War, there was Mengistu, who was communist aligned, but he collapsed when he could no longer be funded by the Soviet Union. And so Ethiopia was in this sort of weird quasi-governmental functioning, not really situation. The Tigrayans put together a military force, reunified the country, put together a bureaucracy, a functional democracy as well for a number of different ministries. The voting is so-so, but they more or less stabilized the country and were an effective governing coalition for about 30 years or so, 25, 30 years. So that's the issue, is that the Tigray feel like they built the country that exists now. They should be able to rule it because of how well they did. And the other ethnicities disagree. And so the Tigray are like, okay, we'll have our own country. And then the other ethnicities are like, no, you won't.
Yeah, my earliest memories of Ethiopia were that especially in the West, people seem to revere Haile Selassie, but I never totally understood what that was all about, because Ethiopia.
Yeah, Haile Selassie was revered because of his resistance at the Battle of Ottawa. Right, we talked about in 1896 the Italians tried to invade Ethiopia, and they were defeated. That battle has basically become a symbol in Ethiopian and many other African and post-colonial states of resistance to European occupation. And not only resistance, successful resistance. The Ethiopians were successful because they traded with the French and the Russians. And because of that trade, they were able to get effective firearms. They were numerically superior to the Italians. They knew the terrain better than the Italians, and they roundly defeated the Italians. And so that sort of solidified Haile Selassie as this sort of defender of Ethiopia in particular, but of colonized peoples more generally. And Jamaicans in particular believe that he was a quasi-messianic figure because of that action. And so the Rastafarian religion really developed around the reverence towards Haile Selassie.
Okay, because I didn't get that part either. I didn't quite understand what that was about. But yeah, there was a big to-do made over the fact that Selassie came to JFK's funeral. In fact, it kind of put de Gaulle's nose a little bit out of joint.
Yeah.
Although a lot of things did in those days. But yeah, and I really never quite understood the concept. I mean, the context, why such a big deal was made about that.
Yeah. No, it's in many of these, as we've seen with Egypt today, and we've seen with other of the colonized states, the small victories and the resounding defeats are all, part of this cherished memory of resistance and independence, right? In Egypt, there is this reverence for Urabi, right? For exactly this reason, right? He stood for the Egyptian people, and he stood against the Alawiya and the Turk-Circassian intelligentsia on one side, and he stood against the British and the Western imperialists on the other. And so you have this, relationship that Egyptians have sort of pegged on Urabi for being the first Egyptian to try and create an Egyptian state. He didn't succeed, but that failure, it gives them sort of pause of like, it was within the realm of possibility that we could have resisted. We didn't, but we still have the power to determine our own future. And that's really powerful for a lot of people.
And de Gaulle would not have considered Selassie's influence and successes in Ethiopia as anywhere near as important as the French resistance, right?
Right. I think there's sort of two reasons for that. I think that our understanding today of post-colonial identity, of post-colonial struggle, is very different than what people felt in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was still a very strong belief in most European halls of power that Africans were not capable of being independent.
Well,
Like,
even 1944, I mean, de Gaulle was totally put out of joint that Winston Churchill entered Normandy before he did.
yeah, I
So,
mean, yeah, de Gaulle is quite a character, but the point being is that even if he had known the facts, I don't think he would have considered it worthy of interest, because there was the view prevalent at the time that things that non-Europeans did were less important because non-Europeans did them. And
okay.
if non-Europeans did them, then Europeans could do them. Like, if, I can do anything a 5-year-old can do, kind of thing.
Okay. And I don't know if you had noticed my comments to Lon about, because this still makes me blush to this day. I was still pretty young when the Belgian Congo revolts were happening, and my family had this very weird relationship with TV or not TV, and so a lot of our information came through magazines and newspapers and radio. And I can remember, being so shook by what I was reading about what was going on in the Congo that I actually added a line to my bedtime prayers, praying that God would keep the Belgian Congo from bombing us.
Yeah.
I still blush to this day every time I think of how little I understood about what I was reading. So again, it's because it makes me blush. That's why I think it's funny. But sorry, I didn't mean to bore you.
Yeah. No, one last comment is about the Jews who fled Egypt. Most of the Jewish population fled Egypt in 1956 as a result of the Suez Crisis. And we'll definitely discuss that probably in 2023 when we talk about the 1950s and 60s in the Middle East. But we've got a lot of ground to cover in just how diverse the experiences are, because those of you who've followed the series, practically nothing I said last week is what happened here, right? Syria and Lebanon are very different experiences from Egypt, and Egypt is going to be a different experience from Palestine and Transjordan, and those are going to be different experiences from Iraq. And so all these sort of come together, and all those were different than what we talked about in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So all these different pieces are sort of moving at their own speed now, in their own different directions, which is part of what makes the Middle East much more complicated in the post-Ottoman period than during the Ottoman period, where you could sort of stay in Istanbul and stay in second gear and just you can see everything.
Yeah,
And the
it
question,
is kind of fascinating that that each of these entities in Northern Africa tends to have a much more distinct history than what we might be used to in, say, European countries.
yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, if somebody broke down like the history of Hungary versus the history in Poland versus the history in Austria versus the history in, I don't know, Croatia, I think people would be surprised by how different those histories are too. They might share that same experience of being between Germany and the Ottoman Empire and Russia, but beyond that, they have different religions. Well, actually, all those four are Catholic, but that they might have different religions, they might have different languages, they might have different senses of empowerment or disempowerment. So
But
yeah,
there's a lot of commonality in food and in music and dance, for example. I mean, much more so than I'm picking up from this series about these various different African countries, or am I just not catching it?
No, there are certainly similarities. Like, for example, I said that Hassan al-Banna was influenced by a Syrian preacher who was Reda. There people are traveling all across the region, but by and large, the idea of a pan-Arab identity is a development in the 30s and 40s. It doesn't exist yet, and so this is part of the process of cultural creation in the modern Middle East. And there's a question of, does the series end with modern day affairs? That is my goal. I'm gonna get there, hopefully. Um,
Already mentioned 2023.
55 episodes down, we're going in the right direction. We started at 600 CE, so I think, we're pretty close. But we've still got about 100 years to go. So, and these 100 years are probably the most complex 100 years and the ones about which we know the most. So there's a lot to talk about.
Well, Richard, you're not taking as long as the actual history took, so that's progress.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody was criticizing a movie, a historic movie, and complaining that some of the details, I'm running Robert's programs, that some of the details were not quite accurate. And I said, come on, you really can't make a 78-year-long movie. You kind of have to, put some things together there, and allow people to fill in the blanks. But yeah, there's a lot. You are covering a lot of material in a relatively short time, even though it seems like a long time to some people, I guess.
Yeah. All right. I think we're gonna close it up.
Yes, thank you, Richard.
All right. Have a nice night, everybody.
Yeah, have a good week.
And keep telling people that trivia, because that's how you make friends.
Which trivia
No,
about it?
no, somebody in the comments wrote, I keep telling people that Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt.
I thought you meant my trivia about my bedtime prayers.
There's that too. All right. Anyway.
Blessings. Have a wonderful weekend.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.